So I think looking at the journey that we've gone on today, a very intensive sort of narrative covering many themes, and therefore to bring everything together and conclude today's activities, delighted, and we are really honoured to welcome the Chief of the Air Staff, Air Chief Marshal, Sir Rich Knighton, to give the closing keynote. Thank you very much, Sir Rich. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Anu, and thank you for inviting me here to speak today. I'm not really, as many of you know, a stranger to this stage, but the last time I spoke about space here was in my final few days as the Deputy Chief of Defence Staff for Military Capability. So this is the first chance, actually, specifically as the Chief of the Air Staff, I've had the chance to talk to and about the future defence space enterprise. I'm delighted, therefore, to have that chance today at what is, I think, a pivotal moment in our thinking about the UK's role in space. Some of what I'm going to say will not be new. This is a keynote, after all, and I'm very conscious that the space community spends a lot of time at conferences around the world. I didn't get invited to speak at Canberra, Colorado, Hawaii. I get London. But I hope, though, although some of this will be familiar, you'll be interested in the priorities and focus that we have as we step into this next few months. Now, it's easy, I think, for us to argue that it's an exciting time to be involved in space, but space has always had that ability to inspire. I was born a few months after Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, but I was captivated by those early space adventures that showed what a united team operating at the cutting edge of technology with a common goal could achieve. I was actually a child of the space shuttle generation, and I can vividly remember watching that first launch. That single event inspired me to start on the path that ultimately led me here today. Now, we all know the story of the NASA janitor, and the term moonshot has entered our everyday lexicon. But what few people know or talk about was the thought that went into the decision to make the moon the target of the US space program in the 1960s. In his brilliant podcast, 13 Minutes to the Moon, Kevin Fong explains how President Kennedy, in April 1961, a few days after Yuri Gagarin had orbited the Earth, he asked for a crash review to identify a space program that promises dramatic results in which the US, could win. Rather than pick a target out of thin air and hope that rhetoric would be enough, they worked closely with the experts of the day, including Werner von Braun, the former German rocket engineer. And after meeting Johnson, the then vice president, von Braun wrote a letter to the president explaining why a moon landing was a goal that could be achieved and achieved ahead of the Soviets. But the US also backed their words with hard cash. The US government during the 1960s spent 2.5% of their entire federal budget on the Apollo program. So at a time when there are a great many breathless claims about space and the opportunities, scale and rates of growth, we need some of that careful thought and honest reflection on what we're good at and what we need that guided JFK and his ambition. Despite my desire for realism and honesty in what is achievable, there is no doubt that the opportunities offered by the proliferation of commercial space capability, cheaper launch, continued militarisation and cost reduction are enormous and will have a profound effect on our way of war. Just as our air power forebearers did over the trenches of the Western Front, our ambition must be to exploit a new domain to help us understand what is happening below us and enable us to strike at our enemies. Now, I love the quote I heard 20 years ago from a US Space Force, what we would now call a Guardian, Theron, who said, "Space is the highest high ground." So as I think about the future, it seems almost certain to me that more and more of our military capabilities will move into space. Increasing use of space for intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance seems inevitable. Ubiquitous AMTI, GMTI, OPI, SIGINT from space are either here or foreseeable. This space-based capability will enable decision advantage and give global sense to support global strike and understanding. But if we're going to exploit space militarily, commercially and economically, then we must be able to protect and defend our interest in space. So for me, control of space, particularly in the context of proliferating and growing threat, is our first duty and a prerequisite for all future operations. So our first priority then must be to protect and defend space so that we can then exploit it. But as well as the military demands and advantages, space also offers the opportunity to drive economic growth through symbiotic relationship with the commercial sector. Our response to the threats we face can also cement strategic relationships through collaboration. There are, after all, no borders in space. So the prize for getting this right is enormous. So let me expand a bit on the argument by setting out first what space does for us today and why it's important. Then by talking about what we need from space, and finally how we deliver it and some of the wider opportunities it gives us. So I'm pretty sure you know this, and I know I'm definitely singing to the choir here, and you've heard of it, some of it on the panel previously, but today our society is truly reliant on space. Banking, the internet, transportation, farming, logistics, mobile comms, and much more all depend on space. It's reported the space sector employs over 50,000 people, and while figures vary, the sector is measured in billions and creates significant economic benefits to the country. This is important and impressive, but the reliance is only going to grow. The McKinsey report from April this year calculated that the global space economy is on track to reach £1 trillion by 2030. With a key goal of the new government here in the UK to grow the economy, this has to be a big opportunity. That growth has been driven by big reductions in the cost of launch, miniaturisation of technology, all stoked by commercial entrants that have been encouraged and backed in various ways by governments. All of this has lowered barriers to entry and turbocharged the growth of space-based technology and capability. One of the consequences, though, of that rapid growth is that from the early days of space exploration in 1957, when Sputnik was the only human-made satellite in space at the time, we now have over 10,000 satellites in orbit. And if you believe some of the predictions, and I don't entirely believe them, but that figure is set to rise sixfold by 2030. And into the mix, there's 130 million pieces of space debris, which leave the potential to damage or destroy our satellites. Operating in space is increasingly problematic and could have serious consequences. The 2018 Beckett report to the UK said that if we were to suffer a disruption in the space-delivered timing signal, it is estimated that it would cost the UK economy £1 billion a day. The space-based capability is without doubt part of our critical national infrastructure, and that's why it must be protected. And that is our job as the military to do that. Not necessarily on our own, but it is our job. So as well as being critical to day-to-day life, space also provides vital capability for the military. Space is a military domain, as you heard from Charlie earlier. It underpins our deterrence, enables operations in all other domains. As our Armed Forces Minister explained here at the Global Air and Space Chiefs Conference a few months ago, our air, land and naval capabilities are still dependent on our ability to operate in space and cyberspace. The ongoing war in Ukraine has shown the influence of space on the changing character of war. Early Russian attacks on Viasat modems, as Charlie also described, to deny Ukrainian command and control were offset by the commercial provision of Starlink. by SpaceX. We know the story. Charlie talked about it earlier. Musk rapidly deployed reported 22,000 terminals, which ensured widespread broadband connectivity in affected areas across Ukraine. When linked to 2,500 satellites, this action stopped Putin from silencing our allies. And when combined with the space-based commercial capability for ISR, it allowed Russian atrocities to be called out. Musk's involvement in the conflict has brought the commercial contribution to warfighting that many had predicted, and to an arena previously reserved only for major state actors. But space does not simply accessorize our way of war. In many respects, it is changing it fundamentally. The Secretary of the United States Air Force, Frank Kendall, said it's not a matter of if space is going to be the decisive domain in a peer conflict, it's a matter of when. And that when is now. The new reality is born from the so-called space kill webs that exploit technological advances in sensing, decision-making, and precision long-range effectors, which enable dramatically faster, more precise global and all-domain engagements. We have to be able to deny, disrupt, limit, or counter our adversaries' ability to exploit these kill capabilities. At the same time, we have to capitalise on the opportunities that this technology offers. Our great power competitors already understand the value of space to our economy, our military, and our way of life. Between 2019 and 2021, the combined operational satellite fleets of China, Russia grew by 70%. Both nations have weaponized space. Both China and Russia are testing and fielding sophisticated counter-space capabilities with the intent to disrupt and degrade Western space-enabled advantage. Chinese academics stress the necessity of destroying, damaging, and interfering with enemy reconnaissance and communication satellites to blind and deafen the enemy. This is an animation of Cheyenne 1202. On the 10th of August this year, the People's Republic of China tested a satellite called Cheyenne 1202, and it came within 116 kilometres of Skynet 5A. UK Space Command tracked and monitored this close approach, ensuring the safety of both satellites. But this sort of activity is becoming increasingly common, and capabilities of uncertain intent that could be interpreted as hostile. So against this context and against this threat, then, what is it that we need? Well, I've emphasised this. The assured access to space underpins our national economy, prosperity, security, and defence. So as I've argued, our first priority must be space control. But there's also a strategic imperative to expand our existing capabilities. Our competitors and our allies see the opportunity are already investing heavily. In the US, around 5% of the defence budget is allocated to space. In the 2021 Integrated Review and the Defence Space Strategy, we laid out the UK's ambition for space, as well as allocating an additional $1.4 billion to new capability. While there's been good progress, including the stand-up of Space Command, as you've heard, progress has not matched the rate of change we have seen from our potential adversaries, or frankly, our ambition. I don't believe we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The DSS is still a pretty good strategy, and it points us in the right direction. But even in the face of that growing threat that I've described, that huge opportunities and choices I've talked about, we need to be crystal clear about our priorities. And I think there are three broad areas where that investment in space capability would make a difference. These are firstly space control, secondly decision superiority, and third global sense to support global strike and understanding. We are already in the UK doing something in all three of these areas, but we're still going to have to prioritise. You probably won't be surprised, given what I've said already this afternoon, that top of this list must be space control. We know that our ability to see and communicate is critical to the way we fight, particularly in the West, and our potential adversaries also know that. As Bled Bowen, who is the space expert and space YouTuber, and I think, Bled, you're in the audience somewhere. I apologise if I butchered your Welsh name. My sincere apologies. But he said this: when satellites are useful for war on Earth, satellites become targets. A couple of years ago, we witnessed Russia's ability to launch a secondary satellite from a recently launched parent satellite. That secondary satellite then closed on an Allied asset and tracked it before it releasing what our Russian friends called an inspection device. It could easily have been some kind of weapon. We were at least able to watch it happen, but we were powerless to do anything about it. So anti-satellite capabilities are no longer the fiction of James Bond. They are real and they are in play now. Our assets are vulnerable and they must be protected. That's why control of space must be considered a prerequisite for future operations. And how do we deliver that? Well, it starts with space domain awareness. But it also includes space command and control and effectors to help manage, overcome countermeasures and deliver unambiguous operational effects. In March, we formed the UK National Space Operations Centre alongside our partners in the UK Space Agency and Met Office. Their subsequent monthly online updates have shown the vital role space domain awareness plays in ensuring space remains safe, sustainable, and accessible to all. This is a great example of the cross-government working that space requires. But I do think we have to go further. I can imagine a new space defence centre that would command and control our mission to protect and defend our space capability alongside our closest allies and other arms of government. This is an area where the UK could become a leader in Europe and in NATO. The next priority after space control is, I think, decision advantage. This is all about how we use space to facilitate communication and connectivity. That is how we will integrate the forces and deliver faster, better decisions than our adversaries. At the heart of this is Skynet. But we know today that a small number of big satellites in geostationary orbit, although essential, are vulnerable and will need to be protected, but also bolstered in terms of coverage and resilience with low Earth orbit mesh constellations, in all likelihood, I think, commercially provided. The final priority then is global sense to support strike and understanding. This is about exploiting opportunities space provides for ubiquitous surveillance across the electromagnetic spectrum. The investment that backed the Defence Space Strategy was designed to help us decide what we needed to own, what we should do in collaboration, and what other nations and what we should simply plan on accessing from the market. There's a real opportunity here, I think, for the commercial sector to provide potentially a lot of what we need. But as we saw recently in Ukraine, we must be wary of over-reliance on allied and commercial capability and capacity. It is not infinite. A nationally owned space-based ISR capability to provide assured tasking, autonomy, and resilience is likely to be something that we want. The truth is, we don't really yet know what the right mix is. As a recent RAND Europe report suggested, one way of approaching the question would be for us to own where necessary, collaborate where possible, and access where prudent. But that's really easy to say and harder to know in reality what exactly is prudent. That is why our programme, My Starry, and the Taiki launched last month as part of that, is on the critical path to determining the right mix of space-based ISR capabilities for the UK. Some nationally owned space-based ISR capability is necessary to assure our access to that capability and add resilience, while also allowing the UK to take a leading role in NATO's Advanced Persistent Space Surveillance Network. So I've inevitably focused so far on the military requirements of space, but one of the most exciting things about space is the opportunity it provides, I think, to team with other government departments and the commercial sector, and the opportunity it provides to deliver economic growth and build on current strategic alliances. The Space Domain Awareness mission we run today is already a great example of how this could work. The mission is executed by one Space Operations Squadron, the UK Space Agency and the Met Office, as I've described. MOD and the UK Space Agency are procuring essential sensors to meet national needs, and are then collaborating with international partners through initiatives such as Olympic Defender and the Joint Commercial Operations System. This cross-government and international collaboration delivers a shared understanding and helps to protect and defend our critical assets. There's more to be done, but this example indicates how this could and should work in the future. And in terms of growth, much of this technology used in space has come from the commercial sector or is already dual use. The space sector is also recognised as being more than twice as productive as the rest of the labour market in the UK. So the opportunities to generate greater returns for defence spending than we might in other areas is really significant. In March, the previous government released the Space Industrial Plan, which reinforced that government's commitment to a vibrant UK space sector. UK companies of all sizes continue to drive innovation and ensure our national operational independence in the contested space environment. But we have to be sharper about the bits that the UK is genuinely good at, or could be good at, and focus our investment on those things. The industrial plan was a good start, but we will need to be more discerning if we're to use government investment to give us sovereignty over the things that matter most and drive growth. But space cannot, for any nation, be a purely national game. Many of our allies have been investing heavily in space technology for decades and have capability that is mature industries with high barriers to entry. And it would be daft for us in the UK to try to compete with them. But as I said earlier, there are no borders in space. And part of the answer to the question of how do we deter and build resilience in space is to work more closely with our like-minded allies. The Combined Space Ops Group is a truly remarkable forum. Having grown over the past few years, it now brings together UK, US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and now France, Italy, Germany, and Japan. But I know they're not all on there. But it has limitations, particularly around its ability to share information in the right classification, and therefore its ability to deliver combined operations. Sharing information, technology, and common missions is, I think, the only way we can credibly deal with the threat. The US is and will be the biggest player, but its focus is increasingly on the Pacific. We and European allies will need to bolster our own capability. But let's do that in consultation with the US and with others rather than going it alone. NATO established a Space Centre in 2020 to support activities and operations. I've been there and seen the fabulous progress that they've made. Although there is a long way to go, I think it could provide the foundation on what NATO can build, on what NATO can build its own NATO Space Command in time. And AUKUS Pillar 2 offers us the opportunity to share information and technology with our closest allies in an increasingly frictionless way. The Deep Space Advanced Radar Capability, or DARC, will be game-changing in terms of space domain awareness. But that ought to be just the start. Let me finish by talking about people. While the technology is fundamental, we must build and retain a workforce of skilled joint personnel with the knowledge, skills and experience to deliver our space ambition. We need our next generation of space professionals to solve challenges that we are only just starting to grasp. Not only are we training and educating the next generation of space professionals at our Defence Space Academy that you heard about earlier, we are also educating a new military profession. What does good space education look like in the multi-domain world? Perhaps an integrated commander asking for space's input at the start of the planning process rather than as an afterthought, or at the strategic level when a national leader who says, where are my space assets rather than where are my carriers? So to conclude, there is much we could say and do about what we could say in space. As we found out with the 50 minutes of introduction from 2 minutes each of the previous panel. Well done to Al for getting as many questions in as you did. But my view is it's important that we do have those conversations, but we think and we prioritise. We are already as a society, highly dependent on space. Space will play an increasing role in military operations, and the demand for assured global and persistent satellite communications and space-based ISR and position navigation and timing is only going to increase. I'm sure that many of our terrestrial and air-breathing assets will be replaced by space-based capabilities in time. But this is happening in an environment where the threat in space is visibly and noticeably growing. The UK is not currently postured or prepared to protect and defend its national security and defence interests in space. Increased resilience against adversary counter space threats and the exploitation of commercially available services will be important tools. But resilience alone will not be enough, and sovereign space control systems are, I think, urgently required. There's a real opportunity here for the UK to lead in Europe. There's a military responsibility, but it will require close cooperation with the rest of government and industry and our allies. A space defence centre could be just what we need. More broadly, increased investment in space, if we are honest and discerning, offers the opportunity to drive growth both economically and as a military power. It will help deliver decision advantage and that global sense and support strike and understanding. Finally, I started by talking about the power of space to inspire. It still has that power. So let's use it to inspire the next generation of space professionals and entrepreneurs, to ensure that we can protect our country and help it prosper. And who knows, there might be another little kid in Derby who stands on the stage in a few decades' time. Thanks very much.
Sir Richard, I could not think of a better way to round up day one of the conference today. What really struck
Drinks, is it?
What really struck me was the way that at the end you rounded up. You highlighted a decent infographic that we use to show size and health of the sector, because the message that's coming through and through, although we've got a defence focus, is that desire to much closer integrate our defence with our civil space capabilities. So with a launch keynote from my boss, Dr. Paul Bates over there as Chief Executive of the agency, and finishing with you, Rich, absolutely perfect. I don't know if your schedule permits the opportunity for any questions.
Yep, I'm really always happy to do that. Very happy.
Okay, so I shall therefore wait to see if my Slido starts kicking in. And there's one straight up.
That's usually a bad sign. Right.
I've been given 5 minutes of timing, so I've got one here from Mark Magachi. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Sir, you mentioned the importance of training our people. How do you plan to ensure the correct personnel are recruited and retained in order to ensure MOD can deliver space to maintain information advantage in an increasingly complex battle space?
So we know right across the armed forces right now, we have some challenges with retention and recruitment. what you can do in defence, what you can do in the military is things you cannot do. You certainly can't do them legally outside of the military. So there's no question in my mind that there is something special about what we do, and that's the thing that will attract people and retain people. We might have to, I think, imagine a world in which instead of people in the Air Force on average spending 20 years, 16, 17 years in service, actually we see people cycle through much faster. We do some training, they spend some time in Space Command or in our space enterprise. And hey, if they go and work for Paul at the UK Space Agency or go and work for industry in Airbus or wherever it might be, they're still part of the enterprise. That, I think, is healthy and good for the service. So it's about emphasising what is cool about space, what we can do in the military, why it's important, that sense of mission. It's also about making sure that we get there's a thing called Haythornthwaite Review of Armed Forces Incentivisation. There's a mouthful, a RAF, but that talks about how we pay people for skills, not necessarily rank or experience. And those sorts of things will help us, but you can't do this sort of stuff anywhere else. And so that's what we'll need to really focus on.
Great. Thank you very much, Rich. I've got another one, which is, I'll put it in, recognising that you may not be able to answer this. It is anonymous, but it's come up and it's the only one on Slido. So, sir, you said that the US at its peak spent 5% of its budget on space. The UK spends significantly less, 1% or less. Also, do we need to spend more? So I think you built...
The short answer is yes, and actually that's what's in the plan, is to spend more. That 1.4 billion was weighted in the 2025 period. I think one of the questions, Sophie pointed this out earlier, is the Defence Review is examining the question of whether that is enough, and whether, as we think about all of the challenges and threats we have in the space domain and the opportunities, whether that should see a shift in the overall balance. And one of the things that I've learned over many years is it's very easy to say you need more of pretty much anything. The hard part is understanding how do you do that within the wider portfolio. What do you give up, and where would you prioritise this? Clearly, there's a need for us to invest more and enhance our capability. That might be that the government decides to invest more in defence. It's committed to spending 2.5%. The Defence Secretary said yesterday that's a cast iron guarantee. Some of that may well go on space, but that's a judgment for the Defence Review and then the department to work through. But short answer is yes, we do need to invest more, and that's the plan.
Okay. Got 2 minutes left. There's a good question here, which also crosses over to some of the civil side of trying to set norms of best practice and behaviours. Given the Chinese behaviour you described in those proximity manoeuvres, how can we and NATO deter such behaviour or work?
Right, 2 minutes is not enough for that. So General Salty, Chief of Space Ops, is really good on this. His central point is thinking about deterrence in space is different to thinking about deterrence in the terrestrial domains. So if you do something, some kind of kinetic effect in space, that doesn't just affect your adversary and it's not contained. It continues to exist for a very long time and affects your own assets as well. And the heart of Salty's argument is that actually there's no such thing as a victory in space. It's about success and it's about control and management. And there are multiple ways in which we might seek to exercise that control and deter our adversaries for doing something else. But for me, about the 7th time I've said it, starts with space domain awareness and space control. And without that, it's very difficult.
Thank you very much, Rich. We're pretty much at time. We had a couple more questions here, but I'm aware that the clock is ticking. And for the first time today, we've overrun, but it's for the best possible reasons. So once again, colleagues, could we show our appreciation to Air Chief Marshal Sir Rich Knighton for his time?